I know you help a lot of people with retirement income planning. So what would you say are the three biggest mistakes that people have? And what are some of the misconceptions about what people need to know about retirement?
Well, that's a lot packed into one very, very big question. I actually think the biggest mistake people make when they're planning for their retirement is not necessarily even a money discussion. It's about a lifestyle discussion. That we have this idea when we're working that when we're working, all we want is time off. We want to relax. We want to have that. But once you retire, you actually have to plan what you're going to do to fill your day. And it's a completely different way of looking at the world. And people quite often plan very well for the first few years of retirement. They're going to travel, they're going to do all these things, but they don't plan past that window about what's life going to look like when they're 75, when they're 80, when maybe the travel is slowing down or whatever those hobbies were that were going to help keep them busy. What happens after that? And I think taking that into discussion also flows back through to the question about what about income? Because when people do think about slowing down, they often assume that their expenses will drop.
Right.
That yes, we're going to travel a lot in the first few years, but then as we stop that, our expenses will go down. And that's not always the case, because quite often the reason things slow down is because you're forced to. People don't stop just for fun. They stop because they're physically not able to anymore. And that might bring additional expenses with it to get more support, to stay in your home, to do all sorts of things. So I think kind of making sure that those reserves are there for the longer term is something people have to think about. When actually structuring the income, I think probably the biggest mistake people make is not really working through the longer term tax consequences of how they balance their income and trying to make sure that they draw the right incomes at the right times. And, you know, that's not particularly difficult work if you understand tax rules and have a way to work through that, which, let's be honest, most people don't and don't want to. But that's where your advisor should be going through that with you and looking at trying to balance out what happens in the early years of retirement for income versus the later years of retirement. Where do you draw extra when you need it? You know, we plan for the day-to-day expenses, but we don't plan for when we need a new car or a new roof on the house or things like that. Where does that money come from when you need it? And kind of making sure those things get brought into the calculation as well.
Yeah, I think that's one thing most people don't really consider is the timing. And if you don't want to pay too much in tax, it's really critical to do planning around that. So, and I agree with you, most people don't think about the lifestyle they want when they retire. They're just so eager to stop working. So out of the non-financial things that people should consider if they want a really happy retirement, what would you say the first most important things are? You mentioned lifestyle, you know, beyond what happens after you travel. Anything else that you see, like in your clients that are happily retired?
Yeah, and I have clients that have happily retired, and I have clients that have miserably retired. And I think some of it takes some soul searching right at the beginning to understand what drives you. And for a lot of people, their identity is wrapped up in their job. And if that is the case, you need something to replace that. You need that purpose. If your job has been your purpose, then you need something else that gives you purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Other people really are quite content to, do little things all day and just putter around, and they're quite content doing that. But it does take some soul searching to do that, because if you're not happy, then all the money in the world can't make you happy.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people where their work is their identity and they never started doing something that was fulfilling that they can continue after work. So I think that's a really important point. And so how would you say that Logan Wealth is different from other wealth management firms? What sets you apart?
Well, I think the difference is, as we work through this with our clients, is because we build everything from the ground up for each client and do everything for our clients on a completely customized basis, that there's no cookie cutter here. People aren't the same. People's needs aren't the same. What people want out of life isn't the same. And by working through all these things with our clients and then laying out, a short-term, medium, long-term plan, recognizing the medium and long-term plans are a lot more flexible than the short one. But working through the tax issues every year on how people draw their income, where they should be drawing their extra income from if they have unusual expenses. We do this on a client by client basis, not kind of in a generic approach. And there are no specific rules for these things. It is very much an individual case. And then we build a portfolio to align with what those needs are likely to be. The fact is, people need to reduce the risk in their portfolios when they start drawing from their portfolio. The more you are drawing as a percentage basis, the more important it becomes to contain the risk. And, it's just really basic numbers. And, I'm probably going to take more time than you want me to here, but I think it's important for people to understand this, that let's say you started out with $1 million portfolio and we're drawing $50,000 a year, which is probably kind of roughly what should be considered sustainable over time. But let's say that is a fairly high risk portfolio that you have, and equity markets drop 30%. So your $1 million has just become $700,000.
Yeah.
Except you have to take $50,000 out to meet your expenses. So really you have $650,000. And now you got to try to recover off of that. Well, now instead of drawing 5% a year, your withdrawal rate is more like 7 to 8% a year. So before you even start, you still have to take $50,000 out for next year to make sure you still have your income. So you're really trying to recover off of $600,000.
Right.
So now you're looking at what about a 65% rate of return plus a 7 or 8% withdrawal rate to get back to where you started. And the reality is you don't. Most people never claw that back. And now you're trying to draw $50,000 off of some reduced amount of capital.
Yeah, and I think often people forget or don't understand the math behind, if you lose 25%, it's not 25% that you need to recover.
That's right.
Right. So, yeah.
And I think we've also had it ingrained in us in the last decade that downturns are short. But that's not always necessarily the case. Downturns can go on much longer. And, even in the last year, we're seeing that. I mean, it's been almost a year now since equity markets started to kind of first show their signs of vulnerability and started to see some weakness coming through. But if you go back to 2000, equity markets declined for 2000, 2001, 2002. If you go through 3 years of decline in equity markets and you've got a high risk portfolio going into retirement, you're not in a very good position. So it's really important once you start drawing, you have to contain that downside risk and make sure that you have that sustainability long term, because there's no guarantee it's a quick rally. It's not necessarily always going to be 6 weeks and everything's rosy again. And if it's longer, it can be really, really hard when you're withdrawing. So that risk needs to be contained to maximize the sustainability of the portfolio. If you are in a place like you were talking about, Pascale, where you have a conservative, a balanced, and a growth portfolio, it's a tax issue sometimes to make that shift down. Because if you're going from a balanced portfolio to a conservative portfolio, from a growth down to a balanced, and you don't have to go all the way to conservative, but you have to kind of veer more conservative, that if you've been there for 10 or 20 years, you could have a lot of capital gains embedded in that portfolio, model portfolio, or fund. And it's a kind of one-off decision, like you just move. So everything happens at once to get you there. Where when we're customizing the portfolio, we know this is coming. We know retirement's coming. We can start transitioning, and we can do it over a period of time. And if we're not 100% there at the day of retirement, that's okay if we're only 85 or 90% there, because maybe your income drops in retirement and we can crystallize the last of the capital gains at that point in time. But you can plan around these things if you're doing this for an individual client.
Right. And also based on all the research, I think you can miss out on opportunities if you don't have someone who on a daily basis is doing the research and know what's going on. So I would say that's of huge value as well. So just to finish off, what are the key important questions that people need to ask when they're interviewing potential advisors. I find that often the question is just about, well, how much return can you make in my portfolio? And I think you have to ask more questions than that. So what would you say those questions should be?
I think the biggest question that doesn't get asked, I mean, there's clear questions that most people ask. They'll ask, a bit about the advisor and what their background is and things like that. But they tend not to ask about process.
Right.
Because if you're going to be successful for people over time, you have to have a process that you follow that is clear, that is repeatable, that gives consistent results. And we try to make sure we explain to everyone what our process is, but it's very, very rare that anyone has ever asked me about that process. Mm-hmm. And that is the key piece, because particularly when you get more towards the brokerage community rather than the portfolio management community, and I'm not saying this to pick on brokers, it's just people operate in different environments. Yeah. They have the wholesalers that come in to pitch product continuously. We're removed from that because of how we build our portfolios. Nobody bothers with us because we're not going to sell their product. But the brokers have this continuous stream of people coming in to pitch product to them. And it's very important that they have a process for understanding the product beyond what the wholesaler tells them, because otherwise you end up with this game of broken telephone that, well, the company says this, the wholesaler says this to the advisor says this to the client. But, information always gets lost along the way when you have those chains. So it's really important that the advisor thoroughly understands that product, not just takes the wholesaler's word, which means going back to original documents and understanding all the pieces behind it. But there has to be a process that the advisor follows to make sure that what they do is there and repeatable.
Yeah, and I think to set expectations so people know this is what good service is going to look like. This is our promise, and we're going to deliver on that promise. Okay, thank you. That's very informative, Julie. Just to finish off, I'm going to ask you a completely unrelated question.
Okay, this one should be fun.
Yeah, so if you could have dinner with anyone dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I would say Queen Elizabeth I of England, because not only did she completely move England forward during her reign, obviously I really like history if I'm going back that far, but she was just such a powerful woman in a time where women had no power, and navigating that and turning out to being one of England's greatest monarchs. I think she would just be an incredibly exceptional person.
Yeah, someone you could learn a lot from. I agree. Well, thanks again, Julie. And for those of you listening and watching, I encourage you to visit Logan Wealth Management at loganwealth.com for excellent webinars, a resource library, and to subscribe to their informative newsletter. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.
Thanks, Pascale.
Thank you.